Hello students, it's Mr. Lavery here, and I'm going to be taking you through various different worked examples about how to analyze historical sources. We're going to be looking at picture sources, we're also going to be looking at written sources. And I'm going to explain to you what we mean by analyze a particular source and how we go about that, go through the process for it for you. I'm going to share my screen now. As you can see, I've created a PowerPoint. Now, this PowerPoint should hopefully be able to help you understand what you need to be doing for that, with regards to analyzing historical sources, and I'll make this one available to you as well. Now, first of all, it's important. You need to know there are two different types of source. Now, you could think, oh, well, that's obvious. There's going to be picture sources and written sources. Those are different types of sources, but that's not what I mean in this context. What I'm talking about is two different types of historical source of evidence. Primary sources. So primary sources, those would come from the time that we're studying. So, for example, you could include things like objects like statues or swords, armor, money, other artifacts. Here's an example of some statues which are the Parthenon marbles. These are currently in the British Museum. These come from the Parthenon in Greece, and they were created thousands of years ago during the civilization of ancient Greece. They could be writing, so things that were written or said by people at the time that we're studying. So, for example, here we have a manuscript done in medieval England. This is illuminated, it's basically got a lot of detail on there. This would be something we could analyze for a bunch of different factors, but it's from the time that we're studying. It's a primary source. Could also be picture, art, or photographs taken from the time that we're studying. So, for example, this one here, this was created in, I think, 1834. And it's more to do with the subject that we're looking at as a Year 9 cohort with regards to the colonization of Australia. Now, the other form of evidence is secondary. So, these are sources of information that are created after the time that we're studying, but they're about what we're studying. So, for example, that could include textbooks. So, right over here, we have the current Year 9 textbook that we use here in Victoria. They could also include history written many years later. As I've said, what we're looking at here is going to be the colonization of Australia, and somebody who's written extensively about that would be a historian such as Bruce Pascoe, who's written many books, including the very well-known Dark Emu. It could also be pictures, art or photograph created about the time we're studying, but after that time. So this is done by a contemporary artist whose name currently escapes me. I believe her name is Gibson. Her surname is Gibson. She was born in 1944, and I think this was created in 2015. So, we're going to look at picture sources first. The first part of the picture sources is this. You need to decide if a picture is primary or secondary. Now, the thing is, quite a few of you here in Australia will have seen that picture over there on the right-hand side of the PowerPoint screen. And you'll probably be able to tell me automatically what it is and where it comes from. But say, for example, if there's somebody in the United States or England or New Zealand or South Africa or any other country where English is a large part of the curriculum, then they might not necessarily automatically know this. Well, if you were to see a picture from those countries, you wouldn't necessarily know. So how can we tell whether or not a picture is, well, how can we tell anything about a picture, where it comes from? Well, this comes from the Year 10 history textbook that we would be using next year at Melton Secondary College. Some of you already know it is. So you look at a caption underneath. If this is something that comes from a history book or from some other kind of source, you find out where it comes from. In this case, the caption tells us. So this is Cathy Freeman lighting the Olympic torch at the opening ceremony of the 2000 Olympics in Sydney. Now, is this likely to be primary or secondary? Well, this is a primary source. And in fact, what I'm currently teaching with my year 10s involves using things like this particular source, because we're talking about the Indigenous experience and the rights and freedoms of Indigenous Australians from 1945 up until the present day. So that is a primary source from a very important moment in Australian history 20 years ago. Now then, part 2. Once you've worked out if a source is primary or secondary, the next part is to describe what you can see in the source. So if you look at this picture, and as you can see at the bottom, it says this photograph was taken on 24th of May 1890, and it shows Aboriginal people from a local mission gathered at the courthouse in Goondiwindi in Queensland to receive blankets to mark the birthday of Queen Victoria. So that's what we already know, that this is a primary source, because you've had a look down here at the caption. Next up, we need to say, what can you see? Now, the caption helps, obviously. It explains where it is, so we know where it is. We know what kind of people are in there. Look at also how the picture is arranged. So no photograph or artwork, particularly if it's one that's being published, is ever done accidentally. These are all very deliberate, particularly back in the period of time we're talking about here, so the late 1800s, where you only ever had one shot at this. It's not like currently we could, if we were posing something like that, we could maybe take 100 different digital snaps and choose the one that we want to represent best. But even then, every published piece of work, whether it be a picture or like an artwork picture where you've painted or drawn or what have you, or something like this where it's a photograph, is composed deliberately. So, for example, you might see over there all of the Aboriginal people here, down here. A large chunk of them don't have that much in the way of clothes on, particularly the men. They're all down here on the floor. Whereas you've got your white European settlers over here, dressed fancy with their hats on, standing above all of the people down here, thereby elevating them. They're shown as being higher up, which shows that they are supposed to be bigger or more important. So again, like I say, how is everybody dressed in a picture like this? Is everybody dressed? Where are they standing with each other? So, for example, in this picture, like I say, we've got the European kind of settler people over here standing very much higher. You might see other pictures where you would see both Europeans and Indigenous Australians on the same level of each other, in which case you could imply or think that they might be being seen as being more equal to each other. Again, like I say, what are they wearing? Because, yeah, you see all of the guys out there, pretty much all have their tops off, but all of the women still have full-on dresses to cover their modesty, because this is a time period where that sort of thing was very much more important. Now, the third part of all of this, with regards to picture sources, you need to analyze. You need to ask why. And you would always be being asked to say, okay, well, fair enough, we know when this is from. You've told me what's in there. Why is this important? So a question you might be asked would be something like, okay, you've described the elements which indicate friendly relationships between the Europeans and Aboriginal people. Well, in this case, well, they're all posed together for photographs, so they're clearly getting on relatively okay. But you also might discuss or talk about what you think this source might say about British attitudes towards Aboriginal people. So, for example, again, we have this thing where we've got them over here and the people there are clearly above the Aboriginal people. So the attitude there might be something where you could say, okay, this photograph clearly says that they think that they are superior to or better than these Aboriginal people who are next to them. So you've got your analysis, you've got your kind of where this comes from. Is it primary or secondary? You've described what's in there. And then you say, okay, so what about this is important? What is significant? What is notable? You'll usually be asked a very specific question about that. But the first thing you need to do is say when it's from and say what's in the picture. The next part is where you say, okay, so you know the when and the what. Now we need to know the why. And the why is always important. The why is our analysis. Written sources follow a very similar pattern. So, as before, first thing we look for is whether a source is primary or secondary. So, this is a source from our study in Year 9 at Melton of the Industrial Revolution. Is this primary or is this secondary? Well, again, have a look down here. Look at this. This comes from 1844. So this is most definitely a primary source. In fact, it comes from Friedrich Engels, who was one of the kind of main thinkers around industrial reform and political reform of the time. He worked an awful lot with the philosopher Karl Marx as well. Now here is another one. Here's a different source entirely. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, investments in science and technology have proved to be reliable engines of economic growth. If homegrown interest in these fields is not regenerated soon, the comfortable lifestyles which Americans have become accustomed will draw to a rapid close. Now again, that's an interesting quote. If you ever look, from Neil deGrasse Tyson, 2014. Now the thing is, 2014 may well be 6 years in the past from now. Here we are in 2020. But that still makes it a secondary source because this is about the time that we're studying, but it's after the time we're studying. Now again, describe what is in the quote. What's it about? Well, if you have a look through here, this is about the working condition of children in the mills and factories of the Industrial Revolution. And specifically, again, if you have a look down there at the bottom, the condition of the working class in England in 1844. Okay, so it's about literally that. And specifically, it's mostly focusing on the conditions of children. Specific points it makes. Yes, there is some schooling available for those children, but they work long hours, and therefore those evenings, most of the time, the kids are too tired to be able to go to school. And even if those kids who are at the school are there, they're not paying a lot of attention. Sunday schools are there, but again, they're not very, very well funded. They don't have much in the way of resources. People don't necessarily attend much. And going from one week to another is too long to be able to remember information. The facts it gives you, well, things like that, it will talk about the fact that there are schools. There have been many witnesses to a Children's Employment Commission report. Sunday schools exist. Things like that. It also gives you, again, the dates. So again, that's your describe part. And again, there's the third part, analyze. So who wrote this? Friedrich Engels. Why is this important? Well, Friedrich Engels is one of the notable people from the time who actually studied this issue, and his writings were spread far and wide. He's also somebody who's notable for working a lot with Karl Marx, and Karl Marx is not only a philosopher, but he's the founder of the principle of communism. And communism becomes a massive political force in the late 19th and throughout the 20th century, and becomes it's massively important. To give you context, I mean, this is something that's written in the middle of the 19th century, and here in the early 21st century, we still have countries that are supposedly communist, such as Cuba, or North Korea, or Vietnam, or China. Does the person who wrote this have a particular perspective? Well, in the case of Friedrich Engels, yes, he was somebody who was actually a factory owner, but he was also somebody who cared for the conditions of his workers and was very much a reformer when it comes to the kind of the industrial thing. That, to an extent, almost doesn't matter for a generalized thing, but these are the questions we need to be thinking of. Who wrote it? Why is it important? Does that person have a perspective or a bias? The bias is important as well, because every person who writes anything down as a historical document has an agenda. They always have some kind of bias to where they're coming from. So, for example, if you're going to be looking at the settlers' descriptions of Indigenous Australians when they first arrive in Australia, then an awful lot of them might sound very condescending, very unpleasant, describing them in very negative terms, because they would look at them and think of them as savage, as primitive, as beneath them in so many different ways. Whereas if you were to read contemporary Indigenous Australian accounts from the time, they might have very different perspectives of these new people who've arrived in their country. So perspective is important, and who is writing and who is saying something is important, because that might inform whether or not they're biased. And that helps us when we are trying to evaluate or give value to a source and try and find out how useful that source is. So, to summarize, when you analyze a source, you have to do the following things. You look for when and where it comes from, describe the source, saying what exactly it is you see, and you analyze it. You've described it, now say what it means or is trying to say. So, for example, this is from 1834. This is a primary source. This is a piece of artwork by someone called Charles Rhodius. It's called Scene in a Sydney Street. And what you can see here is you've clearly got large amounts of, well, all of the people in there are Indigenous Australians, and they're all drinking and fighting and generally carrying on. It paints a very negative picture of Indigenous Australians, and it's done very much from a white settler's perspective. Now, when you get to be analysing everything that you need to analyse for your work, and particularly when you get to analyse the work we need to do for the assessment, all of these things are going to be useful to remember. So, that's it for the moment. I hope you find this useful. I hope you find any of the resources I've created around this useful. And if you're ever struggling with anything around this, try and see if you can remember some of these points, and try and see if you can come back to this clip. In the meanwhile, I'll speak to you all soon, and I'm looking forward to teaching you again very shortly.